Good evening and welcome to this In Conversation event. I'm aware that my camera is slightly strange. I'm a little bit blurry as if underwater. Hopefully that will resolve itself, but if it doesn't, it's not your eyes, it's my screen. Nigel, thankfully, is crystal clear and crisp in outline. So that's good. Tonight, we're going to be talking about free speech. That's the topic of the conversation, and I know that lots of people who've been on social media saying that they're going to be with us tonight in the audience are very keen on this topic. It's a topic that it's of timeless relevance, really, but it's always in the headlines at the moment. Obviously, for most of the history of the UK, speech and expression of most people was restricted by laws of censorship and criminal offences like offences of sedition, offences of blasphemy. Today, freedom of speech and expression is a human right in law in the UK and in fact internationally. But here and around the world, of course, people's freedom of expression is still subject to severe restrictions. But free speech matters. It matters to humanists who think that it is important as a way of finding out truth and as a human right. And so that's why we're going to be discussing it today. And we couldn't have a better person to join us for this discussion. Nigel Warburton spends his time thinking, writing, podcasting about a whole range of topics, but he's been particularly active in free speech. Of course, he's the author of many books, including Thinking from A to Z, A Little History of Philosophy, which you see everyone reading on the tube and on the bus and in the street, and Free Speech, a very short introduction. And his Free Speech Bites podcast series for Index on Censorship was tremendously popular, interviewing a wide range of thinkers on this subject. His other podcast, which if you haven't listened to, I highly recommend it, Philosophy Bites, has now been downloaded over 42 million times. So if you're watching this, to be honest, you probably have already listened to it, since that's a huge number of people. But if you haven't, look it up. So suffice to say, we're very lucky to have him. It's great to see him. Nigel, hello.
Hi, thanks for that.
Maybe we'll start very broad and just ask you to think a little bit about the question of why does free speech matter?
I think before we get to that, we should say what we mean by free. I mean, I want to answer that question, but some people think that when you talk about free speech, you're talking about unlimited freedom. And I think it's very rare for anybody to argue for that. There are a few people who think there should be no restrictions on expression at all. But most people in this area want to have liberty, not license. They want to draw the line somewhere. And the interesting question is where you draw the line for each kind of issue, whether it's pornography or racist speech or whatever it might be. So that's the first thing, that it's free speech. Extensive free speech is what I'm in favor of. I'm not in favor of totally free speech, totally free expression.
Well, we think we'll definitely come back to that, because the limits on free speech are almost as interesting as free speech itself as a concept.
And by speech, we mean more than just the spoken word. Obviously, we mean the written word. We mean more than words as well. We mean pictures, moving images, and so on. So free expression is the shorthand for free expression, I think. Okay, so why does it matter? Traditionally, and you mentioned this already, people like John Stuart Mill have thought it was one of the best ways of getting at the truth, or in fact, he thought it was the best way of getting at the truth. Simply dogmatically stating what you believe isn't enough. You need to have your views challenged, evidence comes in, people present contrasting opinions, contrasting evidence, counter-arguments, and so on. And through the collision with truth and error, gradually, perhaps, truth emerges. That's the hope. That may or may not be true. That may be a good way of challenging falsehood, certainly, but it doesn't necessarily reveal the truth. So that's one area, the question about how we find out about things. And for me as a philosopher, it's incredibly important that you don't just present beliefs without any kind of interaction with the world. So I think free speech in relation to truth is often about how we think together in public, how we, as a community of people who are interested in discovering things, hone in on the truth, get rid of obvious falsehoods, present different ways of seeing things, sometimes jolt people into a completely different way of thinking about something.
Yeah.
I think it's incredibly hard to do that on your own. There is that kind of caricature of a philosopher sitting in a room or an armchair or an ivory tower, just pulling thoughts out of their head. Even when they're doing that, they're typically imagining an interlocutor. There's somebody they're arguing with. There's somebody in the past. There's somebody who could have been sitting in the other armchair arguing with them. It's very, very difficult to just think in a monologue.
Yeah.
So that's the truth bit. But there are other arguments for why free speech is important. Some people think it's a matter of self-expression, that to be authentic as a human being, you need to be able to communicate what you feel about the world, what you believe about the world, what you believe to be true about the world, and that if you restrict that extensively, you're somehow preventing people to be fulfilled as individuals.
Yeah, and happy.
And also to interact in public in an honest way. If there are things I can't say, even though I believe them and they're fundamental to my being, that seems to be extremely damaging to me. And there has to be a very strong reason for not, certainly in a society which values individuals, there has to be some strong reason not to allow me to do that. And there may be that, depending on my views, but that's another kind of argument. Another one that's important is the role of free expression in democracy. If you can't present some views because they're too dangerous or too frightening, there's a sense in which you can't participate in a democracy. You can't criticize some views. There's a risk of the dominant views being treated as the truth with which you cannot argue. Where there's a sense that we value free expression, there might be room to listen to opposing voices, even if we then have counter arguments. I mean, John Stuart Mill thought that the most useful people in the world are the ones who disagree with everybody else, because they force people to think. They force people to clarify what they think. There are any number of people with the orthodox view, but it's the ones who are a bit odd and presenting uncomfortable views that do us the most good as a society, because they move us forward. There's one other reason that free speech can be important, is that if you don't trust the government, you don't want speech restricted. You think we should be able to criticize and point to what's going on, and I think that's particularly important at the moment. Particularly when some of the press seem to be very reluctant to criticize the government under the pandemic, or possibly because the BBC is threatened in terms of its license fees and so on. But there should be freedom to express critical thoughts about what's happening in a way that isn't true in China, for instance, isn't true now, sadly, in Hong Kong. This is something valuable if you're suspicious of the government, you should be allowed to express that view. And it's often the government that's doing suppression of
yeah, well, like you said at the beginning there, it's restrictions on free speech have typically mostly come from governments in history. I mean, they're the ones who are in power and who restrict your speech for their own purposes, for the protection of their own agenda, or for the control of populations, or for whatever reason. I suppose churches and religious organizations as well have sought to restrict it. So for personal fulfillment and for happiness and for social health and the functioning of democracy and for coming to the truth, they're all the reasons why. I suppose the other thing is that freedom of expression, I mean, there's a personal benefits, but freedom of expression is also the thing that allows us to have access to the thoughts of others. I mean, I've always thought of it as being quite a connective thing. Without freedom of expression, we couldn't understand other people and connect with them and gain a lot of the experiences that make us quite fulfilled. So there's fulfillment to be had through our own freedom of expression, expressing ourselves, giving full rein to our curiosity and creativity without fear. But there's also the opportunity to know other people that comes from their having freedom of expression, and not just in some lofty collective endeavor to get to the truth, but just to connect, with other human beings, and to sort of be warmed by that and have genuine, authentic connections with them. I think that's important, as well as the opportunity to change our minds if we disagree with them.
Sorry, I've just picked up on that. That fits very much with the idea of conversation is important for human beings. This is public conversation, or private conversations are how we think together, how we develop our ideas, and we really need to do that. it's an exceptional person who can just go away to a hut somewhere,
Exactly.
think clearly.
Well, I remember meeting a humanist from Saudi Arabia who found himself in Cardiff eventually. Luckily for him, he was had made his way to the UK, and he described for me what his life had been like when he had begun to challenge the beliefs that he'd been brought up with, and that his family and the state and everyone in Saudi Arabia, right, was trying to impose on him. And he described how he went for walks in the desert and just spoke, to the air out loud. It was the only, and he said his thoughts didn't feel real to him until he'd expressed them. And I thought that was really important point. And when I tried a few years ago to justify why freedom of thought was important and what freedom of thought meant, I found it was actually really hard to do without some reference also to freedom of speech, because like you say, it's actually, thought only happens when you start expressing ideas either to yourself or out loud or in conversation. So it's sort of indispensable, isn't it, freedom of expression, if you want to be, a thinking person, a human being who has ideas that they test and develop, and you've got to share them.
In philosophy, that sometimes it's criticized, but there is a tradition of testing ideas to destruction, so that if somebody puts forward an idea, you actually treat them with respect by challenging that idea, by showing possible flaws in the argument or counter examples that seem to undermine it. Because you're treating it as an argument, you're not treating it as a bit of dogma. You're treating it as something that we can work on and make better. But from outside, it often looks like a blood sport.
Yeah.
And there has been a move in philosophy to be more congenial and collegial, and
really?
Collegial is probably the wrong word, because colleges are rife with kind of disagreement and nastiness, but
amiable
and work as a team all together. And there's
a place for both those
value
things.
in that, and supportive, and if people are fragile. But I think there also has to be a place for robust disagreement that takes an argument forward or clarifies what's going on, or at least allows somebody to see that the view that they hold isn't shared by everybody. I mean, as a humanist, religious people are incredibly important to me, actually, because they clarify what I think and what I don't think. I wonder how easy it would be to be a humanist if there were no religious people left.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think that's a very good point, because you're always testing not just your ideas but your thoughts and out, with a hypothetical interlocutor, even if it's not an actual person. I find, anyway, that's how I think. I think critically about your own thoughts and think, why do I believe this? Why do I think this? And when you're doing that, you're talking to yourself. But you're also talking to an imaginary person who is disagreeing with you, right? So I think that's right. If that had never been possible in real life, how would we imagine it in our heads? I don't think we could.
Well, you're playing God's advocate, presumably, when you do that.
Yes, that's right. I think of myself.
What John Stuart Mill said was that it's actually better to have the person who believes the stuff rather than imagine what they would say.
Yeah, that's always better. I can see that. Even if you want to, do you ever find yourself sort of helping people out who disagree with you, making their argument a bit stronger? That sometimes happens to me in discussions. I think, oh, actually, you're not. You could do better than that. There are other reasons for believing in God than that. Come on, what about this one? Ironic. Anyone who wants to ask questions at any time, by the way, this is a free speech forum. Oh, just as I said that, a very long question appeared. We'll get to that one later. I'm hoping that more will come in too. But we'll go on a little bit further ourselves, I think. But any questions that you want to type in, who's in the audience here, do so, and we will come to them. I want to talk a little bit first about some of the limits on free speech, since we started to get into that. Having talked about the value of free speech, which we just have, and you've clarified, I think it's really helpful, that I think it's very helpful today, actually, in the sorts of debates that are going on, and the way that the phrase free speech is bandied about as if it's just obvious to everyone what it means, and it's a clear principle, and often a sort of absolute, treated as if it's an absolute thing by some people, not by lots of people, but by some people. And I think that's partly influenced you'll know more about this than I do, but the culture of the United States, for example, is highly influenced by the idea that there should be or could be untrammeled free speech, at least in theory. In practice, they have libel laws like everyone else, but in theory, there's a sort of First Amendment, untrammeled free speech type culture there. The United States is one of the few countries in the world that hasn't signed up to international conventions on race hate crimes, for example, because it's incompatible with the First Amendment as they've seen it in the past American administrations. But like you say, almost no one actually believes in completely untrammeled license, because almost everyone does draw some lines. And I just wonder what you thought the most important lines that needs to be drawn in a liberal society. Let's assume we're only talking as liberal people who've got a liberal conception of rights and freedoms. What are the important limits?
The easiest one, I think, is incitement to violence. If somebody deliberately tries to get a crowd to attack an individual, you can't defend that on their right of freedom of expression, that they should be free to say, here's the target, go and get them.
And why is that? Is that because there's a harm to some other person? And it's
this is fairly obviously leading to harm when it actually does lead to violence against somebody. That's a physical harm. And that's the kind of thing that John Stuart Mill, I'm going to go back to John Stuart Mill because his second chapter of On Liberty from 1859 is the kind of classic liberal statement of why we should have extensive freedom of expression. And for adults, paternalism is only appropriate towards children generally, and there are many good reasons for society for having extensive freedom of expression and a presumption of a freedom of expression. He said the limits are where you are bringing about physical harm. In his example, it's context dependent. You can write corn dealers are starvers of the poor in a newspaper editorial, the blog post, as it were, of the day, but only open to the select few and only read by certain sorts of people in common rooms or whatever. That's fine. But if you have the same words written on a placard and wave it outside a corn dealer's house in front of an angry mob, that's not legitimate free speech. That's the point where you're inciting violence against somebody. It's very predictable consequence of that action.
Right. So reasonably foreseeable consequence of your action, and also the context in which you're. It's a bit. It's almost legalistic.
It's the context in which you're communicating. It's what you're doing with the words. It's that matters.
That's really important today, isn't it? Because especially in a world where a lot of people's speech is people are providing their own context to it. You think about when someone says something online, they don't actually know the context in which that will be read, right? But also, if you think back to
Trump's words in front of an angry mob,
great example.
He did know the context and he did know the likely outcome. There's a kind of implicature, as philosophers would say. It's not that he said go and attack, but according to many people, his words could be construed as meaning that. So he's communicating something indirectly through those words.
Exactly.
And for me, that's the important issue, actually, because that's how we communicate. We can use irony. We can say the opposite of what we seem to be saying and still very clearly get our meaning across. It's not a very literal interpretation that we have to take into account. So context is all. This is where it gets difficult. So it's kind of easy to say incitement to violence should be the limit of free expression, but it gets harder when you say what violence is, because some people think you can have violence committed with words alone. So violence with a stick is very easy to identify.
I prefer to talk about harm, wouldn't you, than violence? Because when you come to justifying something like laws against libel, for example, or I suppose maybe you're coming onto this, but sort of false claims generally, I guess, like false advertising claims, like this holy oil will cure your AIDS or something. These are harms rather than direct violence.
Sure, but I was thinking more of the kind of, there's a kind of hate crime that's committed by somebody.
So it's incitement we're talking about.
Well, no, not incitement. Who's trying to damage somebody with words. So somebody who repeatedly uses abusive words, putting somebody down over and over again, with the worst possible words they can find, isn't just expressing a view in a public place. They are using vocalized noises to cause damage to somebody's brain, effectively. This is trying to make people feel really, really bad. And I think there must be circumstances in which we can acknowledge that you can cause psychological harm deliberately with words, and it might be more damaging to the individual than a punch to the nose.
But those words would have to amount to, harassment, intimidation, persecution. They'd have to add up to causing a, extreme hostile environment. I'm
not talking about a single microaggression or something like that. Right. That's the thing. Right. It's very hard. This is then a question about how do you draw the line between the kind of abusive speech that is somebody expressing a nasty view that they hold and somebody who's deliberately harming someone. And it's context dependent. I think it involves understanding quite a lot about what's going on in that particular case. So it's very hard to have a general rule. I mean, I think everybody who practically works in the area of free expression is constantly looking at drawing the line and considering details of different cases in a kind of judicial way. So there's we've got general principles that we want to preserve. I feel I'm a self-confessed liberal. I want to preserve extensive freedom of expression for as many people as possible, even when the views that people express are deeply offensive to some people. I think it's better that we have the possibility of them expressing those views. I'm not going to praise them for expressing offensive views at all. But I think it's important that we allow that possibility. But I do want to draw the line. I do think if somebody's causing psychological damage by repeatedly, deliberately putting somebody down in a horrible way.
Does deliberately matter? You said deliberately twice there. I'm just wondering, because if you're harassing someone or creating a very hostile environment for them inadvertently, does that
Well, I think that's an interesting question. In law, mens rea is important often.
But in what we're talking about, in terms of where it would be acceptable to limit free speech, you wouldn't make someone's intention the basis for a limitation on their free speech necessarily, would you?
If somebody accidentally,
I don't know.
The difference between accidentally stepping on someone's toe and stamping on someone's toe may not be physically that much different, but in terms of how you treat the individual who's done it,
it's difficult, isn't it? Because someone might be a little bit. Take people who do so-called hate preachers, for example, in the United States. Now, obviously, people who go to gay people's funerals, or the God hates fags type brigade with their signs, they are actually doing it deliberately. But you could conceive of situations where they say it was a sign outside a church, or signs outside churches, or preachers who are saying particular things, and what they were doing was expressing their view, but inadvertently it was creating hostile environment for people. Would that allow? Does it matter that they don't? That's not what they mean to do.
I think it matters. I mean, I think morally it matters. I mean, I think there's a huge difference between not covering your head in a religious place where people worry about that kind of thing by mistake, and deliberately going in there without something on your head in order to.
What if you told that preacher then, not hate preacher? What if you told that preacher then, oh, do you know that there's a gay person living opposite this church and they can't even leave the house because of their horror at the things that you're shouting every time they go out of their hall? Would that become deliberate? Is that when it would suddenly flip?
I mean,
that's why I'm pushing at it. I can't decide myself.
In the examples you're giving, I suspect First Amendment law in the US allows people to do things which would not be tolerated in the UK in
Yes, I think
terms
so.
of anti-homosexual slogans and this kind of thing. So I think they could claim First Amendment protection.
I'm sure they could, yeah.
The question whether the law is better in the US or the UK is a difficult one. Neither's perfect, is what I have to say. They're experiments, aren't they? And
they are. I mean,
and I think these are continuing conversations. I mean, the trouble with the situation in America is it doesn't look like you can change very much connected with the Constitution.
No, it's very difficult.
So I think we're in a better place where we can have the conversation about whether this is working and whether we should try and extend free expression, or whether there's some kind of serious infringement on people's lives by a kind of one-size-fits-all law that forbids certain sorts of practices.
Yeah,
I mean, I think this is important, and obviously when these things are decided, they're decided in terms of the specifics of the case for us very much.
There are some interesting international standards now, like for example, under the auspices of the UN, which has the Rabat plan of action, named after Rabat, where it was adopted, about sort of trying to actually producing international standards of various thresholds. And I think threshold is quite a good concept here, is that, you know, that if you, a government, a state somewhere, is going to introduce restrictions on freedom of expression, the first thing is that it can never be like the restrictions of the past. You know, no government, it can't be legitimate anywhere for any government to try and introduce the sort of restrictions we saw, for example, in the UK until very recently, of just, you know, trying to protect the government with laws of blasphemy or sedition or whatever. And it can't be blanket censorship because the government doesn't like an opinion. So that sort of goes without saying. But then there are sort of series of thresholds, like you say. Is it, you know, when have we tipped over into, well, you are now highly likely and deliberately to be provoking violence, or you are now highly likely and deliberately to be provoking a climate of potential violence for a particular group? You know, this is the Karl Popper example of, you know, or the Karl Popper question almost, because although people say he answered this question, I always feel he was more posing it in a way, of sort of like, when does the moment come when you have to say, through your advocacy of these, you know, intolerant policies, you have reached the point where, you know, were you to prevail, people would be on the way to the gas chamber now. And so you nip that in the bud in different ways. And I think the concept of threshold is quite an interesting one, but it can only be applied in real contexts. You know, I don't think you can ever answer that question in the abstract.
I worry that people are too ready to censor people. And this is increasingly visible within British universities, for instance.
Yes.
To jump in and say, you can't even say that. You can't even get up on a platform and discuss this matter because it offends me. And I'm with John Stuart Mill on there, that offence shouldn't be the measure of whether something's censored or not. Merely causing offence to somebody isn't damaging them psychologically in the way that we were talking about before, that sort of deliberate...
Maybe the opposite. Offence can disturb your opinions and lead to personal intellectual development.
Yeah, and obviously there's a tradition of saying, well, you develop a thicker skin because, you know, you're going to meet people who offend you all over the place if you're that fragile, and it's going to be a very difficult life for you. But then the response is going to be something like, well, you're talking about my religion, you're talking about my sexuality, you're talking about something which is fundamental to me. It's not just a trivial thing. This is my very being that you're questioning by even discussing this kind of topic. The trouble is there are so many people for each topic that we could possibly discuss. You end up not discussing anything, and the universities become places where there are no-go areas for thought all over the place. They're kind of, it's a minefield, so you can't speak about things which are important to other people who don't necessarily share the oppressed group's beliefs.
Right.
And we were seeing that in a number of different areas. I mean, the fairly obvious one where it's become quite polarized is in terms of talking about TERFs versus trans, as it were,
Well, there's a number of very different and intersecting discussions there, aren't there? Because there's matters of national law, there's matters of the situation in the US, which is different from the situation in the UK, and then there's issues on campus. I mean, that's just, I often think of that whole, what could you call it? Topic, theme, area, phenomenon, I don't know, as being almost a sort of a case study in how divorced of context different people's speech acts and expression can be, because in that particularly there are so many different, I mean, I've lost count of the number of times I've seen someone say something about this topic on social media and have it received by another person in completely different context from the way that, to me, it is very clear that transmitter is intending it to be. And I suppose this comes back to what you said at the beginning about context. The context is really important. But so my question is, in a situation where I can read your tweet either in the bath thinking lofty thoughts about philosophical topics, or I can read your tweet standing outside an abortion clinic wondering whether or not to throw the stone through the window, like how can we meaningfully talk about context anymore in terms of statements that might be misconstrued or
okay, so social media is something else. Let's get on to that in a second. But the question I was raising is about free speech within universities, which I think is a especially important case. And it all turns on what you think the point of a university is. If you think it is a place where you receive information, the vessel is filled up with knowledge, as it were, then it may be that if you're very confident how things are, you can simply pour the right stuff into the vessel, and wrong stuff is not allowed to be anywhere on the premises. But if you think of it, as I do, as a place where people are exploring thought, learning to think, doing research on serious research about how the world is and how human relations should be, entertaining lots of ideas which they may then reject, then there's huge value in that situation of a diversity of viewpoints and the possibility of genuine free expression. And that's
but of course that's
really
right,
preserved by free speech policy, by law in Britain, and so on. And that vision of the university is the one that currently prevails, but may not always, given that some people politically would be quite happy to see universities as ways of getting people into work. Preparing them for trade, as it were.
And there are always government initiatives about free speech in universities, which often are about limiting speech rather than freeing it up.
So I think there is a special issue about universities, and that the possibility of no platforming speakers and so on is there is it's a bit, as I said, it's a bit of a minefield, but I think a very wide spectrum of views should be.
There's a question about this actually. It's just come up. It's saying, should free speech be freer in the university than in other settings?
Well, I think it is a special setting. I think it's a special setting. But some people have a different view of what a university is, and that's something we should, debate publicly if we're going to change that. But traditionally, I don't see
why it is a special setting. Could you expand more on that? I mean,
because it's a place where people are exploring ideas,
but every place should be like that, shouldn't it?
Well, I think there's a division of labour in society, and that some people have more time and energy to reflect on what's going on, and other people are busier doing other things. And there's a sort of, we use universities to do the research. We use universities to train people to think, hopefully training people to think for themselves, not simply to be indoctrinated. Though obviously there's some indoctrination that goes on, but there should be the possibility of developing honing tools of thinking, techniques of thinking, and doing research, whether empirical or otherwise, that transfer to all kinds of situations, allow us to think for ourselves and to contribute to society as a result of that, rather than being kind of unthinking cogs in a machine that's been built by somebody else. Each generation is building its own version of how things should be, and trying to find out and decide amongst them how things should be, and need to be able to, particularly when young people coming to universities are I mean, in my view, it's like what John Stuart Mill said, you know, the value of hearing opposing views, encountering people who believe things very different from your own beliefs is part of education, that it shouldn't just be a comfortable ride of just having your prejudices confirmed.
Yeah, but I agree with all of that, and I think schools should be the same. You know, I think
But
that all
schools is more
places of
complicated, though.
education should be
Yeah.
the same broadly. I mean, you might draw the line with different harms different, because you might want to create different types of environment with different levels of comfort within schools as well. But I can't, and so I agree with everything you said about universities, and I think most of the questions are sort of that are about universities, as I look at them here, you've basically answered by what you've said there, and I think it's for others. But I think it would be a bit not defeatist. I think I would want the same spirit of inquiry and critical thinking and openness to ideas of different sorts to be in more places in society than just universities. I mean, I think that it's right to protect academic freedom. Like, I think that's important, but most undergraduates aren't academics, right? They might be having an education at university, but I would like the same freedom and breadth of opinion to be everywhere, really, including, you know, in public service media. I mean, you can't force people to listen to everything in those other places. I suppose what you might be saying is that in university, you've got people who've actively signed up to think hard about opposing points of view, and so you can legitimately force them to do so, you know. But wouldn't we like that everywhere? I'd like a whole society to be infused with that spirit of broad range of opinions and everything else. I don't know. I'm not convinced university is special, and I hope it isn't, actually, because most people don't even go to university, you know. So I'd like to think that more people than those who go to university can enjoy this atmosphere of contrary opinions and investigation and open-mindedness.
But also self-expression. That's something which often gets neglected in a more kind of utilitarian calculation about truth. I think even if you've got false views, as many, you know, in my view, many religious people have some fundamentally false views, but they should be free to express those views as fully as they wish. That's important. It's important for them, and I'm convinced by that rather crude hydraulic model that if you stop people doing something, it's going to pop out somewhere else. Definitely. And it may not pop out as words. It may not pop out as art. It might not pop out as music. It's going to pop out as violence, possibly, or something rather nasty. If you keep stopping people expressing the thing that's most important to them.
The contrary example that people always give to that, we must come on to some questions, but the contrary example that people usually give to that is the operation of race hate speech laws in the UK and in other countries too, and the extent to which prohibiting certain statements has led to not just their suppression, but in part their eradication. And like all sociology, it's an impossible experiment to run twice, you know, so you can't ever really prove that it was the prohibition of certain statements that made society less racist, which it is, or it's still racist in lots of ways, as we know, or whether it was something that would have happened anyway, or whether it was actually the open challenging of racism somewhere else that eradicated that. But some people would argue the first proposition. They would say, well, a case study against what you've said is the criminalization, as it happened, of certain types of speech, which has helped to change people's minds by the eradication of certain types of expression. So you criminalize race hate speech, and society is a great deal less racist a few decades later. And that might be true.
I mean,
I don't know.
I wish it were true, but racism is pretty prevalent.
But it's less so than
UK.
it was.
I mean, if you have a situation where the Labour Party is accused of racism, plausibly, that seems to be.
But it's less racist. People might be lying, of course, but when you ask people questions about they're designed to test their racism. So, for example, you know, would you like to live next door to you? People from this list? Would you like a child of yours to marry someone from this list? Would you like, you know, they give less racist opinions now. They might be lying, of course, on the surveys, where they give less racist opinions now than they did, 4 or 5 decades ago. And some people would say that one of the things that has produced that lower level of racism was the effective suppression. This is just thinking out loud, by the way. I don't believe this necessarily myself. Is the effective suppression of those types of speech that maybe changed the environment as a result of being suppressed. I don't know if that would mean that the suppression of those opinions was correct or justified, by the way. I'm just saying that it might, if that were true, it might be a contrary argument to your idea that it's the other way around and that you need sort of free speech for.
We didn't talk about social media. I mean, I know you want to get to questions, so what would you like?
Social media. Well, social media, I think is too big a thing. So let's go to some questions. Should there be awareness of the relative power held by the person expressing their free speech and the person receiving that view? Really interesting question.
Yeah, this is the punch down argument, isn't it? It's wrong to punch down. It's okay to punch up, as it were. It's not a bad rule of thumb in life, is it? That if you're going to take something out, try and do it on somebody who's higher up the hierarchy than you, rather than take it out on the royal family. They've got it coming, but don't do it to the person serving you in a restaurant or emptying your bins, because they're on a low wage and doing a job that they may not be completely comfortable with when you do that to them, whereas the royal family just shrug it off and say it's just an upstart anyway. It's difficult to know. Power relations are complicated.
Well, that's I was going to say that you don't know who's up and who's down. I mean, that's one of the, in any given context, it can be someone quite powerless can turn out, someone who as a category is quite powerless can turn out to have a lot of power. I mean, I remember just a few weeks ago when there was the Batley Grammar story, right, which was mostly, I think, not actually about free speech. It was about education. It shouldn't be seen as a free speech issue. But one of the things that was definitely true is that some people were criticizing the teacher for having shown cartoons of Muhammad by saying that that effectively in doing so, that was punching down, because Muslims as a group, very marginalized, very oppressed, very disadvantaged, badly thought of in the public and associated with terrorism, which this cartoon would have exacerbated, said these critics. And yet a crowd of Muslim parents protesting managed to have a teacher forced out of his job, into hiding, change the entire school curriculum, which I know from personal professional experience is hard to do after decades of campaigning, and looked to me like they had a lot of power. So the question of who's powerful is not always one that has an easy answer. And so you can be accused of, punching down, and then you find that really the people that other people are saying are the victims can actually be the people who are exerting a lot of power in any given situation. I think is a problem.
I have a personal problem with this, because I tend to think we're all equal.
Should be or are.
People as equal, it's a kind of sense of respect if you challenge them on things which you think they merit being challenged. It's the kind of authentic relationship. It's a difficult one. I mean, it's context dependent. Again, that's an easy cop out, but it's in terms of access to a platform to express opinions, things have changed for the better for apparently weaker groups, and I would say through the internet it's become possible to express views and probably to find other people who are sympathetic to your views. It's much simpler than it was when I was growing up. I mean, the idea that somebody at 18 could find a national platform for their views would be almost unthinkable, because they wouldn't get heard, they wouldn't get published, they wouldn't even get it published in a newspaper letter page probably, and that wouldn't create much of a stir. But if somebody's got something interesting to say, or can find enough other people who want to hear what they want to say, you can do that from your phone in the bath, as you point out. You can, whether on Twitter or through a blog or through Instagram or whatever it might be, there are these new platforms which increase the possibility of all of us to communicate our take on the world. And that seems to be a good thing in general, although it's obviously had bad consequences as well. But we shouldn't play down the good consequences too much.
No, I think that's right. Here's a question about something we haven't touched on, but which might be easy to answer actually, because it might be about another potential line that you might draw around freedom of expression or limitation that you might draw. Considering that the majority of us spend a considerable part of our lives in a working environment, what can be said about free speech in a private versus a professional context? I think this is important because I think we probably all do recognize that the workplace is another place where we might legitimately limit people's freedom of expression. I mean, I wouldn't expect to be employed as an Anglican priest and be allowed to say there was no God from the pulpit every Sunday. You know, I think that your employer can require certain conformity and certain views from you, I think.
Wasn't Don Cupid doing more or less that?
Yeah, but I think that, well, that's true. Okay, that's true. But I think it would have. I think if his employer had pointed out to him that this was possibly inappropriate, then not many people would have had much sympathy with him.
I think it's fairly obvious that it's fairly obvious that we can be expected to have our expression restricted in the workplace, and all of us do. It's very rare I mean, it's usually explicit, but it contractually explicit. Certainly, there are things you can't say about your company. There may be secrets. There may be things which you can't say in certain contexts. There may be tacit understandings that you cannot constantly challenge your boss about everything that the boss tells you to do or whatever. There must be restrictions, either explicit or implicit, in those workplace relations. And I think it's as there can be and should be probably in a sports club or whatever. There are things that you don't do and things that you do, and it's a kind of artificial, created, understood environment. But it gets difficult if
how far does it go? I mean, how far can you limit?
Because your expression isn't just what you say. It may be your dress code. It may be some religious symbol or humanist symbol that you want to wear that somehow conflicts with the role that you're expected to perform. It's difficult. I mean, I think we compromise a lot in the workplaise. I've tried to keep out of it as much as possible.
Exactly. You don't know much about the workplace recently.
Yeah, so I'm more of a freelancer, and you get a bit more liberty that way.
I think I think an employer could. I think it's totally legitimate for it. I think, you know, obviously, so that you can do. So the employer obviously has a legitimate interest in limiting your expression so that you can do your job, and so you can't, like, as you say, malign the brand or say things. You know, be work in a butcher shop and tell every customer that meat is murder. You know, all those sorts of things are very obvious. And I suppose, though, your employer also, it's legitimate for them to limit your freedom of expression in the interests of a comfortable working environment for other people. I mean, I wouldn't expect to be allowed to tell my religious colleagues, you know, every day about how all their beliefs were wrong. You know, that would be annoying. And an employer could legitimately say, well, look, you know, we've all got to work together. You can't go on about that, you know, all the time. And you've got to treat other people with respect and not go on about irrelevant things. I suppose that's all legitimate, isn't it? And I think I personally would allow employers to go quite a long way down that line, actually. But then some people are obviously trapped in jobs, and so you might feel that it's the context depends again, doesn't it, really? If someone's very free and mobile, they could leave any time.
You know, there may be many different aspects of our life within which we cannot express our heartfelt views. As long as there's at least one place you can do it, I think you've got something important in terms of your freedom. Your freedom of expression exists, but it doesn't mean you can constantly express that view wherever you are to whomever you wish. But there is somewhere where you can do it. If you're never allowed to say that you're an atheist, for instance, if there's no context in life where you can say you're an atheist, I think you're harmed, definitely.
Exactly.
In an important way. That makes
and you mean not just privately? You mean not just privately? You mean also also with others in public?
The domain is really important for freedom of expression. This is where most of the clashes about freedom of expression occur, because you've got the possibility to influence other people. So some kind of public domain, whether it's written or spoken or performed expression of something important to you, that you don't just have to hide in your bedsit and talk to your mirror. That's the kind of freedom that's important, that there is somewhere. And I agree with you. I think that there are legitimate restrictions of different kinds in different workplaces. It would be odd for a school teacher, I think. I had this. So I was, my Latin teacher at school when I was 12 would finish the lessons early and then read from a book to us, which was In God's Underground, about smuggling Bibles into East Germany. Nothing whatsoever to do with Latin. He later became a famous bishop of Liverpool, this guy. And that seems to me wrong. That's a misuse of your freedom as a teacher to decide what's spoken about in the lesson. And I think he could legitimately have been curbed from doing that.
Yeah,
sort of using a Latin lesson to preach religion seems wrong.
Again, teachers are a special case. Like, this is why Batley Grammar wasn't about free speech, or shouldn't have been made about free speech. It was obviously about education, because we restrict teachers in all sorts of ways. We restrict the way in which they're allowed to deliver the curriculum. We have a national curriculum. We prescribe curricula. Human rights law says that teachers have to be objective. Equality law says they've got to deliver in a way that doesn't, create an intimidating environment for anyone. So I think that's obviously right.
So there are role responsibilities. And that's right. They're with limitations to free expression, of course. But I wouldn't stop that teacher expressing those views in a church or going to his Bible study group and expressing those views. There are places where he legitimately could have expressed those views. It didn't seem appropriate.
Here's an interesting question linked to that, actually, is that someone is, which I know that we're closing down on time, but and we've got hundreds of questions, 30 left. So one question about employment here, which I think is really interesting, actually, is that given everything you've just said, I think it'd be interesting to know what you'd say to this, is that recent problems have often arisen when employers want to restrict their employees' ability to speak outside of the work context, in the public square. And I've got a lot of sympathy with this, actually, because working for Humanists UK, it is very easy for someone who is associated with you as an organization, especially if you're an organization in a cause, to say something completely outside of their employment with you or their connection with you, which reflects back on you in some way. And so if, you can see why if an employee of your company, let's say, goes out and says something very racist, you're very worried that will reflect back on you. And so you could just say, well, look, we don't try and make a window into our employees' minds when they're not on the job. And you could just say that. But if you wanted to say, oh, that is unacceptable, we require, good behavior by our definition of good in all public doings of our employees, is that legitimate? I mean, some case law says it is, for example. Yeah, it depends on the job, exactly.
I mean, if you're a police officer, it seems pretty legitimate to me to not to be expressing views completely at odds with the job, the role that you're doing. It kind of undermines not just your role, but also the whole trustworthiness of the police if you're aggressively racist outside of the context of being in uniform. Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I haven't got a straightforward answer.
What about if you're a librarian or you work in Greggs or whatever? I only say that because that was my first job, working in Greggs. So I'm trying to think of workplaces that I've known.
Is to try to preserve as much freedom as possible and have very good reasons for curbing it.
But you could think of reasons. There are eventualities where that would be justified. I think that's really the answer to the
Greggs,
question.
if you start, with Greggs, if you start slagging off the company products, at a certain point you undermine the company that you're working for.
If I was racist, I said some racist things, people, and then Greg's on social media. I mean, this has happened, right? People have said things about gay people or trans people or different racial minorities on their social media or in their private lives, and as they would say it in their private lives, they said it publicly. and their employers have said, we don't tolerate this because as an organization, we want to be clear that our own image, our brand, is against discriminatory statements, negative statements about people based on sex or based on race or whatever. Is this the shrinking of the private sphere almost? I don't know. I'm not sure what type of question this really is.
Usually questions of freedom of expression are about where the law draws the line. And probably the law is not going to forbid people from saying that, but it doesn't mean the company can't sack you. There may be, you may have signed a contract which allows you to be sacked if you don't toe the line on certain issues. It's not quite the same, but I would go back to the sense that there should be some way. Yeah, the work thing is an interesting challenge because your identity becomes so much tied into the necessity of earning a living.
Yeah, in our economy, definitely.
So I think there are kind of pragmatic issues for anybody in that situation about what you do in public and how it's perceived. Yeah, it's difficult.
It's very difficult. Yeah. We're not getting many answers. The headline here, I think, for both of us is that it's also dependent on context, but that there are clearly all sorts of lines and thresholds around which, you might think it was more or less legitimate to limit people's expression in different ways.
And I think the way that we get it is by a conversation. We have a conversation about it. We don't just sort of say, yeah, that's forbidden, that shouldn't be done.
Yeah,
we should talk about it and see what we think.
How easy is it to have that conversation, do you think? And where are people having it? Because I think there aren't many spaces where people are having that conversation.
Well, I guess first of all, there's a question about whether somebody perceives that they're being curbed in some way. Is it a serious restriction of their freedom of self-expression to have a dress code, say? That's something that's come up. It came up in Japan in a big way, with women being expected to wear high heels to work and so on. So I think there's a question of whether you are actually feeling that there are things you can't say, and then whether it's legitimate sacrifice for the work. Is it legitimate morally to expect somebody to curb that aspect of themselves to do the job? It may be just you're in the wrong job.
Yeah, but I wonder if I wonder if employers are well equipped to have those sorts of conversations with their staff, whether even people who run universities are well equipped to have those conversations with their own faculties and people who make those decisions. I don't think politicians are particularly well equipped to make that, to have those conversations when they're looking at hate speech laws, either domestically or internationally. So I don't know whether or not, I think you're absolutely right that you come to a conclusion on the basis of a conversation about a specific instance, but outside of a tribunal or a law court, I find it really difficult to imagine that happening in anything like a constructive way.
Well, I know we've got to end, but I think the question is whether other things trump free speech, a presumption of extensive free speech. And there are obviously occasions when other things do trump that. But they have to be pretty serious things in a life. If you can never express your atheism, that's something badly wrong with society, I feel.
Yeah, so that's my experience of my working life, right? So in my working life, I work with people in humanist organizations that are underground, in places like Pakistan or places in Southeast Asia or the Arab world, where literally to speak their minds is a crime. And I think that it's so interesting, isn't it? That is at one end of a scale where, we don't think about that enough, actually. I think when we're sort of obsessing about some of the questions that come up under the alleged banner of free speech in our own country, when you just think, and they matter too, of course, obviously. I'm not saying, well, what about people who is worse elsewhere? Our own issues also matter in the UK. But really, we still live in a world where free speech is so curbed legally that some people, if they speak their mind, the thoughts in their minds were to make their way to their lips, they would be imprisoned and perhaps killed. Political dissidents, religious dissidents, humanists. And I think that would you think that in a world where that is true, we should talk more about that and less about some of the more ephemeral free speech issues that come up in the UK or in the more affluent West? Or do you think actually that both sets of issues are as important?
I think both are important. I made this series you mentioned for Index on Censorship, where I interviewed a number of people talking about free speech, some of whom have been imprisoned and tortured for their beliefs. And what's amazing is the incredible courage of people who've been tortured. Zarganar from Myanmar had been tortured in solitary confinement for 2 years for making fun of the military regime, and he still carried on doing it. You know, there are these the Belarus Free Theatre.
Yeah, exactly. They're amazing. Yeah,
amazing courage, and it's these people who've been through this and know what it's like to have to be physically and mentally damaged for expressing their beliefs. Think and will say free speech is an incredibly important value. It's incredibly important. If you don't really know until somebody tries to take it away just how important it is. And so I think those people need to be not just sort of admired and known about, but recognize that there are lots of people around the world like that.
Yeah, who are doing that every day.
And what it is, if you lose free speech, that's the direction you're moving in. I mean, we should be grateful that people can stand up and fight with their bodies against that kind of terrible suppression of speech, but we don't want to get anywhere close to that. And so those little questions are all on that. I don't believe it's a slippery slope exactly, but they all are contributory factors to moving towards something where extensive authoritarian suppression of speech occurs. I mean, we see what's happened in China. It would be terrible if anything close to that happened in Britain.
We do have to end. There's so many interesting questions that I've copied and pasted them into a document in the hope that you might agree to answer some of them on another occasion. But it's been very stimulating, of course, and wonderful to have had this conversation about free speech. I think this is probably a topic that we'll return to as Humanists UK, and I'm sure in your case as an individual, in the coming months and years. So I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk again. But for now, thank you very much, Nigel Warburton, for talking to us about free speech. Thank you to the audience, and see you next time.